Thomas Mitchell wiped the sweat from his face as he looked at the angry river in front of him. The water was brown and fast, carrying broken tree branches and mud. It was spring of 1882, and the snow from the mountains had melted too quickly. The Colorado River was higher and more dangerous than he had ever seen it. Thomas was 34 years old and had been a trader for 12 years. His weathered hands showed the hard work of frontier life. His brown hair was getting gray at the sides, and deep lines marked his face from years of squinting in the desert sun. He was not a tall man, but he was strong from years of loading and unloading supplies. Behind him, 3 pack mules waited patiently. They carried blankets, coffee, flour, and other goods that people in the remote settlements needed. Thomas had been traveling alone for 3 weeks, moving from one small town to another. This was his life, and he knew no other way. The river made a loud roaring sound as it rushed past. Thomas had crossed this river many times before, but never when it was this wild. He needed to get to the other side to reach Silverton, a mining town where people were waiting for his supplies. The miners had families and they needed food and warm clothes. Thomas walked along the riverbank looking for a safe place to cross. The water was at least 50 feet wide here, maybe more. Usually there were shallow spots where a man could walk his horse across without much trouble. Today there were no shallow spots. The water was deep and fast everywhere he looked. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Belle, snorted nervously. Belle had crossed many rivers with Thomas, but she could sense the danger too. The mules shifted restlessly, their packs making soft, jingling sounds as the metal pots and pans knocked against each other. Thomas pulled out his pocket watch. It was almost noon, and he had hoped to be across the river by now. If he could not find a way to cross today, he would have to camp here and try again tomorrow. But the people in Silverton were counting on him. Some of them might not have enough food to last another week. He led Belle and the mules further upstream, hoping to find a better crossing spot. The sound of the rushing water was so loud that he almost missed it. But then he heard it again, a human voice, crying out in fear. Thomas stopped and listened carefully. Over the roar of the water, he could hear someone calling for help. The voice was coming from downstream, back toward where he had started. He quickly tied the mules to a strong cottonwood tree and jumped onto Belle's back. The horse needed no urging. She could hear the cries too, and horses have good hearts when people are in trouble. Thomas rode back along the riverbank, his eyes searching the brown water. The mist from the rushing river made it hard to see clearly. Then, through the spray and foam, he saw something that made his heart jump. A person was in the water being carried downstream by the current. From this distance, Thomas could see it was a woman. She was fighting hard to stay above the surface, but the river was winning. Broken branches and logs swirled around her, and any one of them could knock her unconscious. Thomas had seen people drown before. The frontier was a dangerous place, and the river had claimed many lives over the years. But he had never seen someone fight so hard to survive. The woman was tall, much taller than most women he knew. Even from the riverbank, he could see that she was strong, but the river was stronger. Without thinking, Thomas spurred Belle toward the water's edge. The horse stepped into the shallows, then stopped. She knew the danger as well as Thomas did. The current would sweep them both away if they went too far. Thomas looked around quickly. About 20 feet upstream, a large boulder stuck out of the water. If he could get there, he might have a better angle to help the woman. But she was moving fast with the current. In another minute, she would be swept around the bend and out of sight forever. He made his choice. Thomas pulled his rope from the saddle. It was a good rope, strong and well made. He had used it to pull stuck wagons out of mud and to tie down heavy loads. Now he hoped it would be strong enough to pull a person out of a raging river. He tied one end of the rope around his saddle horn and made a large loop with the other end. Then he urged Belle into the water. The horse stepped carefully on the slippery rocks, fighting to keep her balance as the current pushed against her legs. The woman was getting closer. Thomas could see her face now. She was young, maybe 25, years old, with long black hair that floated around her in the water. Her skin was the color of copper, and Thomas realized she was Indian. Her clothes looked like Apache dress, but he could not be sure. She saw him and tried to swim toward the shore, but the current was too strong. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she had not given up fighting. Thomas admired her courage even as he feared for her life. When she was about 15 feet away, Thomas threw the rope with all his strength. His first throw fell short. The woman reached for it but could not grab it before the current pulled her past. Thomas quickly pulled in the rope and threw it again. This time, his aim was better. The loop landed right in front of the woman. She grabbed it with both hands and held on tight. The rope went tight and Belle braced herself against the pull. For a moment, Thomas thought the horse might be dragged into the deep water. But Belle was strong and smart. She backed up slowly, fighting against the current that tried to pull the woman away. Inch by inch, Thomas pulled the woman toward shore. She helped by kicking her feet, but she was getting tired. Her grip on the rope was slipping, and her head went under the water twice. Just when Thomas thought she might let go, Belle found solid footing on a gravel bar. The horse pulled harder, and suddenly the woman was close enough to the shore that Thomas could reach down and grab her arm. With his last bit of strength, Thomas hauled the woman up onto the bank. She collapsed on the muddy ground, coughing up river water and gasping for air. Her clothes were torn and she had cuts on her arms from the branches in the water. Thomas jumped down from Belle and knelt beside the woman. She was unconscious now, but she was breathing. He could see that she was indeed Apache, and she was the tallest woman he had ever seen. Even lying down, he could tell she was nearly as tall as he was. The day was getting cold, and the woman's clothes were soaked. Thomas knew he had to get her warm and dry, or she might die from the cold even though he had saved her from the water. He looked around and saw a sheltered spot under some large rocks about 100 yards from the river. It would be a good place to make camp and build a fire. Thomas picked up the unconscious woman and carried her to the shelter. She was heavy, but he managed. As the sun began to set over the desert, Thomas built a fire and tried to save the life of a woman whose name he did not even know. Thomas worked quickly as the sun got lower in the sky. The Apache woman was still not awake and her skin felt cold to the touch. He had seen people die from being too cold and wet, even after they were safe on dry land. He gathered dry wood and built a good fire in the shelter of the rocks. The flames gave light and warmth to the small space. Then Thomas faced a problem that made him uncomfortable. The woman's clothes were soaked through and she would not get warm unless he got her dry. Thomas was a gentleman, raised by his mother to respect women. But this was a matter of life and death. He turned his back and carefully removed the woman's wet clothes, replacing them with a dry blanket from his pack. He hung her Apache dress and moccasins near the fire to dry. The woman had many cuts and bruises from her fight with the river. A deep scratch ran down her left arm where a sharp branch had hit her. Thomas cleaned the wounds with water from his canteen and tied cloth strips around the worst cuts. His hands were gentle, the way his mother had taught him when he was a boy, helping with injured animals on their farm. As he worked, Thomas looked at the woman's face. Even unconscious and hurt, she was beautiful. Her features were strong and proud. Her long black hair spread around her like a dark river. But what struck Thomas most was how tall she was. Lying down, she was almost as long as his bedroll. He guessed she was at least 6.5 feet tall, maybe more. Thomas had never seen a woman so tall, Indian or white. Most Apache women were shorter than the men, but this woman was different. There was something special about her, something that made Thomas think she was important to her people. Night came quickly in the desert. Thomas kept the fire burning and watched over the woman. Several times she made soft sounds and moved a little, but she did not wake up. Thomas gave her sips of water when she seemed to be stirring, letting the liquid trickle into her mouth. The night was cold, as desert nights always were. Thomas wrapped himself in his coat and sat close to the fire, keeping watch. Belle and the mules were tied nearby, safe but nervous. Wild animals sometimes came to water at night, and the smell of blood from the woman's wounds might draw them. Around midnight, Thomas heard coyotes howling in the distance. The sound made Belle snort and stamp her feet. Thomas added more wood to the fire and checked that his rifle was loaded. He would not let anything harm the woman he had worked so hard to save. The woman slept through the night, but her breathing was steady and strong. When Thomas checked on her, he could feel that her skin was warmer. The fire and dry blanket were doing their work. Her body was fighting to get better. Just before dawn, when the sky was turning from black to gray, the woman's eyes opened. She looked around quickly, trying to understand where she was. When she saw Thomas sitting by the fire, she tried to sit up too fast and winced from pain. Thomas held up his hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy," he said softly. "You are safe. I pulled you from the river." The woman looked at him with dark, intelligent eyes. She said something in Apache, words that Thomas could not understand. Her voice was weak but musical, with a deep, rich quality that matched her height. Thomas pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said. Then he pointed to her and made a questioning look. The woman understood. She touched her chest and said, "Ayanna." The name sounded like water flowing over stones. "Ayanna," Thomas repeated, and she nodded. It was a pretty name, and it seemed to fit her. Ayanna looked around the camp and saw her clothes drying by the fire. She looked down at the blanket covering her, and then back at Thomas. Her face showed that she understood what he had done to help her. In her eyes, Thomas saw gratitude, but also the pride of a woman who was not used to needing help. Thomas handed her a cup of coffee he had made. It was strong and bitter, the way all trail coffee was, but it was hot. Ayanna took it carefully and sipped the dark liquid. She made a face at the taste, but she drank it because she needed the warmth. "River," Thomas said, pointing toward the sound of rushing water. "You were drowning." Ayanna nodded and spoke in Apache. When Thomas looked confused, she tried again, in broken English. "Water came fast. I was getting plants." She pointed to a leather bag that Thomas had not noticed before. It was wet and muddy, but still tied to her belt. Thomas understood. She had been gathering something, probably plants for food or medicine, when the flash flood caught her. Flash floods were common in the desert during spring. A storm many miles away could send a wall of water down a dry creek bed in minutes. Ayanna tried to stand up, holding the blanket around her. She was unsteady on her feet, and Thomas quickly moved to help her. When she stood to her full height, Thomas was amazed again. She was taller than he was by several inches. Her head came up to his chin, and he was not a short man. "You are hurt," Thomas said, pointing to the cuts on her arms. "Rest." Ayanna shook her head. "My people," she said. "They will worry." Thomas understood her concern, but he could see that she was not strong enough to travel. She had lost blood from her wounds, and the fight with the river had exhausted her. If she tried to walk home now, she might collapse before she got there. "One day," Thomas said, holding up one finger. "Rest one day. Get strong." Ayanna looked at him for a long moment. Thomas could see her thinking, weighing her options. She was clearly a woman who was used to making her own decisions. Finally, she nodded. Thomas felt relieved. He had not wanted to argue with her, but he also did not want her to die on the desert because she left too soon. As the morning got brighter, Thomas cooked beans and bacon over the fire. The smell of food made Ayanna look interested. Thomas could tell she was hungry, probably had not eaten since the day before. He gave her a plate of food and watched her eat. She used her fingers, the way most people did on the trail when they had no proper utensils. The beans and bacon were simple food, but Ayanna ate with the manners of someone who had been raised well. After eating, Ayanna felt stronger. She walked to where her clothes were drying and felt them. They were still damp, but better than they had been. She looked at Thomas and pointed to a group of large rocks about 50 feet away. Thomas understood that she wanted privacy to get dressed. He nodded and turned his back, busying himself with packing up the camp. When Ayanna came back, she was wearing her Apache dress. It was made of soft deerskin, decorated with beads and colored thread. Even torn and stained from the river, it was beautiful. The dress showed how tall Ayanna really was. The hem came down to her ankles, but Thomas could see that it had been made specially for her height. Most Apache women were much shorter, and their dresses would have been too small for Ayanna. During the day, Thomas and Ayanna learned to talk to each other using simple English words, Apache words, and hand signs. Ayanna's English was better than Thomas had first thought. She had learned some from traders and soldiers who had visited her tribe. Thomas learned that Ayanna was not just any Apache woman. She was the daughter of a chief, and she was also what her people called a medicine woman. She knew which plants could heal sickness and which could ease pain. That was why she had been by the river when the flood came. She was looking for special plants that grew only in wet places. The leather bag she carried was full of roots and leaves that would help her people. Even after her terrible experience in the river, Ayanna was worried about the plants. Some of them were rare, and her people needed them for their medicine. Thomas was impressed by Ayanna's dedication to her people. Even hurt and far from home, she was thinking about others before herself. It reminded him of his own sense of duty to the miners and settlers who depended on his trading trips. As the day went on, Thomas found himself enjoying Ayanna's company. She was intelligent and curious about his life as a trader. She asked about the goods in his packs and seemed interested in how white people lived in their towns and cities. Thomas told her about his travels, about the different places he had seen and the people he had met. Ayanna listened carefully, sometimes asking questions in her broken English. Thomas realized that she was learning more about his world, just as he was learning about hers. The afternoon was warm, and Ayanna's strength was returning. She helped Thomas prepare their simple dinner, showing him which wild plants near their camp were good to eat. She knew the desert in ways that Thomas, for all his years of travel, did not. As evening came, Thomas knew that tomorrow they would have to part ways. Ayanna needed to return to her people, and he needed to get his supplies to Silverton. The miners were still waiting, and Thomas had never failed to deliver his goods. But for now, for this one day, a white trader and an Apache medicine woman shared their fire and their stories under the desert stars. It was a meeting that neither of them would ever forget. The second day dawned clear and bright. Thomas woke up early as he always did on the trail. The fire had burned down to glowing coals during the night, but the weather was warm enough that they had not needed much heat. Ayanna was already awake when Thomas opened his eyes. She was sitting by the dying fire, looking out toward the desert where her people lived. Her long black hair caught the morning light, and Thomas could see that she was thinking deeply about something. "Good morning," Thomas said in English. "Good morning," Ayanna replied. Her voice was stronger today and the cuts on her arms looked better. She was healing quickly, the way healthy young people do. Thomas built up the fire and made coffee. He offered some to Ayanna, but she shook her head. She had not liked the bitter taste yesterday, and Thomas did not blame her. Trail coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, as his old friend Jake used to say. After breakfast, Ayanna stood up and stretched her long arms above her head. She moved like someone who was used to being active, and Thomas could see that she was feeling much better. The terrible experience in the river had not broken her spirit. "I must go to my people today," she said, mixing English and Apache words. "They will think bad things happened to me." Thomas nodded. He understood that her family would be worried. If one of his own family members had been gone for 2 days without word, he would be out searching for them too. "Which way?" Thomas asked, pointing in different directions. Ayanna pointed toward the northeast, where the desert stretched away toward distant mountains. "One day walking," she said, holding up one finger. "Maybe less." Thomas looked in that direction and frowned. The desert looked empty and dangerous. There were no roads, no water that he could see, just rocky hills covered with cactus and thorny bushes. For a woman alone, even a strong woman like Ayanna, it would be a hard journey. "Dangerous," Thomas said. "Wild animals, no water." Ayanna smiled, and Thomas saw pride in her dark eyes. "I am Apache," she said simply. "Desert is my home." Thomas realized that he had been thinking like a white man. Ayanna had grown up in this land. She knew where to find water and how to avoid the animals that might hurt her. The desert that looked empty and dangerous to Thomas was full of paths and landmarks that Ayanna could read like a book. Still, Thomas worried. Ayanna was tall and strong, but she was still recovering from her ordeal in the river. What if she got lost? What if she collapsed from weakness before she reached her people? "I can take you," Thomas offered. "My horse can carry both of us part way." Ayanna looked surprised by his offer. For a moment, Thomas thought she might accept. But then she shook her head. "My people might not understand," she said carefully. "White, man bringing Apache woman, they might think wrong things." Thomas understood. There was little trust between the Apache people and the white settlers. Both sides had reasons to be suspicious of each other. If Thomas rode into an Apache camp even to help Ayanna, her people might see it as a threat. "But you helped me," Ayanna continued. "Apache people honor debts. I owe you my life." She reached up and touched something at her throat. Thomas had not noticed it before, but Ayanna wore a small necklace. Hanging from a thin leather cord was a piece of turquoise, blue-green like the color of water in sunlight. The stone was carved into the shape of a small bird. Ayanna lifted the necklace over her head and held it out to Thomas. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said, "and her grandmother before that. Very old, very sacred." Thomas stepped back and held up his hands. "No," he said, "I cannot take that. It is too important." Ayanna's face became serious. "In my people's way, when someone saves a life, there must be payment. If you do not take gift, the debt stays. I will owe you forever." Thomas had heard about Apache customs from other traders. He knew that honor was very important to them, and that unpaid debts could cause problems. But the necklace looked like it was worth more than money. It was a family treasure, something that should stay with Ayanna's children and grandchildren. "Take something else," Thomas said. "I have food, blankets, take what you need." Ayanna shook her head firmly. "Food and blankets have no power. This necklace has power of my family, my ancestors. It will protect you on your journeys." She stepped closer to Thomas and pressed the necklace into his hand. The turquoise felt warm, as if it held the heat of the sun. The carving was so detailed that Thomas could see the tiny feathers on the bird's wings. "What kind of bird is this?" Thomas asked, looking at the carved stone. "Eagle," Ayanna said. "In Apache way, eagle carries prayers to the sky spirits. Eagle sees far, flies high. This will help you see danger before it finds you." Thomas closed his fingers around the necklace. He could feel that this was more than just a piece of jewelry. For Ayanna's people, it was a connection to their past and their beliefs. By giving it to him, she was sharing something very personal. "I will treasure it," Thomas said, and he meant every word. Ayanna smiled, and her whole face lit up. For the first time since he had pulled her from the river, she looked truly happy. After that, the mood in their small camp became lighter. Ayanna helped Thomas pack his supplies, and she showed him some of the plants she had gathered from her leather bag. Many of them were wilted from being in the river, but some were still good. She picked up a root that looked like a twisted piece of wood. "This stops pain," she said, pretending to rub her arm where she had been cut. She showed him another plant with small white flowers. "This one helps fever, makes sick people better." Thomas was fascinated. He had always thought of the desert as an empty, lifeless place, but Ayanna showed him that it was really like a medicine chest, full of plants that could heal and help. Her knowledge was amazing, and Thomas realized that she was not just the daughter of a chief. She was a learned woman, someone her people came to when they needed healing. "How did you learn all this?" Thomas asked. "My grandmother taught me," Ayanna said. "She was great medicine woman. She taught her grandmother too. Knowledge passes from woman to woman like the necklace." Thomas began to understand why Ayanna had been so worried about the plants in her bag. This knowledge was not written in books. The way white people kept their learning, it was passed down by word of mouth from one generation to the next. If something happened to Ayanna, some of that knowledge might be lost forever. As the morning passed, Thomas found himself wishing that he could talk to Ayanna longer. She knew so much about the desert and her people's ways. Her mind was quick and she had a sense of humor that surprised him. When Thomas accidentally spilled coffee on his boots, Ayanna laughed, a rich, musical sound that made Thomas smile, too. But they both knew that time was passing. Ayanna needed to return to her people, and Thomas needed to deliver his supplies to the miners in Silverton. They had shared something special, but now their different worlds were calling them back. Around noon, Thomas saddled Belle and loaded the pack mules. Ayanna checked her leather bag and tied it securely to her belt. She had braided her long hair and tied it back with a strip of leather. Dressed in her traditional clothes, she looked every inch an Apache woman, proud, strong, and ready for the desert journey ahead. "I will walk with you to the river crossing," Ayanna said. "Show you safe place to cross." Thomas was grateful. He still needed to get across the river, and Ayanna might know something about the water that he did not. They walked together toward the river, leading Belle and the mules. The water was still high, but it was not as wild as it had been 2 days before. Thomas could see places where the current was slower, where the bottom might be more solid. Ayanna studied the water for several minutes. She picked up a stick and threw it into the river, watching how it moved with the current. Then she pointed to a spot about 100 yards upstream from where Thomas had first seen her in the water. "There," she said. "Water is not so deep. Bottom is hard rocks, not mud. You can cross there." Thomas looked where she was pointing. The river did look calmer there, and he could see rocks beneath the surface. It would still be dangerous, but it was much better than trying to cross where the water was deepest. "Thank you," Thomas said. "You may have saved my life just as I saved yours." Ayanna smiled. "Now we are equal. No debt between us." They reached the crossing point, and it was time to say goodbye. Thomas felt strange about parting from this unusual woman. In just 2 days he had learned more about Apache people than in all his years of trading in their territory. Ayanna pointed toward the northeast again. "My people are that way. Follow the dry creek bed to the red rocks, then turn toward the big mountain. You will know it because it looks like a sleeping woman." Thomas looked where she pointed and tried to memorize the landmarks. Someday he might need to find Ayanna's people, though he could not imagine why. "What is your father's name?" Thomas asked. "Your chief? Nalnish," Ayanna said with pride. "He is wise leader, good man. If you ever need help in Apache lands, you can speak his name. Say that you helped his daughter Ayanna." Thomas nodded and stored the name in his memory. Nalnish. It was good to know the name of a friendly chief, even if he never expected to need it. Ayanna held out her hand, and Thomas shook it. Her grip was firm and strong, the handshake of an equal. Then without another word she turned and walked away into the desert. Thomas rode away from the river crossing with mixed feelings in his heart. The turquoise necklace lay warm against his chest, hidden beneath his shirt. Every few minutes, he found himself touching it through the fabric, making sure it was still there. The trail to Silverton was rough and rocky. Thomas had traveled this way many times before, but today everything looked different. The desert that had always seemed empty now appeared full of life. He noticed plants he had never seen before, remembering how Ayanna had explained their uses. A bird flew overhead, and Thomas wondered if it was an eagle like the one carved on his necklace. Belle picked her way carefully over the stones and around the cactus plants. The mules followed behind, their packs swaying with each step. The animals seemed to sense that Thomas was thinking about something else. Belle stopped twice to make sure he was paying attention to the trail. By evening, Thomas had covered good ground. He made camp in a sheltered spot between 2 large rocks, the same way he had done hundreds of times before. But as he sat by a small fire eating beans and bacon, his thoughts kept going back to Ayanna. Thomas had met many people in his 12 years as a trader. Most encounters were brief. He would sell his goods, collect his payment, and move on to the next town. Sometimes he made friends, but he rarely saw them again. Life on the frontier was like that. People moved around, following work or running from trouble. But meeting Ayanna had been different. In just 2 days, she had shown him a completely new way of thinking about the desert and its people. Thomas had always respected the Apache as skilled fighters, but he had never understood them as people with deep knowledge and rich traditions. The Ao necklace was proof of that. As Thomas held it by the firelight, he could see the careful work that had gone into carving the tiny eagle. Every feather was perfect, every detail exactly right. Whoever had made this necklace was not just skilled. With their hands, they were an artist. Ayana had said it was very old, passed down from her grandmother and great-grandmother. Thomas tried to imagine all the Apache women who had worn this necklace over the years. How many dangers had it protected them from? How many journeys had it witnessed? Now it belonged to him, a white trader who had pulled one Apache woman from a raging river. Thomas felt the weight of responsibility that came with such a gift. Ayana had trusted him with something sacred to her people. He would have to prove worthy of that trust. The next morning, Thomas continued toward Silverton. The trail climbed into the mountains where the air was cooler and pine trees grew on the hillsides. This was different country from the desert where he had met Ayana, but Thomas found himself looking at it with new eyes. He noticed how the Apache people might travel through this land, using the natural paths between the rocks and following the ridges where they could see far in all directions. Thomas began to understand why the Apache were such good fighters. They knew the land like he knew the rooms of his childhood home. On the third day, after leaving Ayana, Thomas reached Silverton. The mining town sat in a valley between two mountains, its wooden buildings looking small and temporary against the huge rocks and tall trees around them. The miners were glad to see Thomas and his supplies. They had been running low on flour and coffee, and their wives needed thread to mend clothes that had been torn by the rough work of mining. "Thought you might not make it this time, Thomas," said Bill Henderson, the general store owner who usually bought Thomas's goods. "Heard the river was running high." "It was," Thomas said, remembering the wild water and Ayana's fight for her life. "Had some trouble getting across, but nothing I couldn't handle." Thomas did not mention Ayana or the rescue. He was not sure why, but it felt like something private, something that belonged just to him and the tall Apache woman who had given him her family's necklace. Business in Silverton went well. Thomas sold all his supplies and collected payment in silver coins and small gold nuggets. The miners were honest men who paid fair prices for good goods. By the end of the week, Thomas's saddlebags were heavy with money instead of merchandise. But Thomas found it hard to enjoy his success the way he usually did. His thoughts kept going back to Ayana and wondering if she had made it safely to her people. The desert could be dangerous, even for someone who knew it well. What if she had collapsed from weakness? What if wild animals had found her trail? Thomas told himself he was being foolish. Ayana was strong and intelligent. She had grown up in the desert and knew how to survive there. She was probably safe with her people right now, telling them about the strange white trader who had pulled her from the river. But the worry would not go away. Thomas had never felt responsible for another person the way he felt responsible for Ayana. It was more than just concern for someone he had helped. Somehow, in those 2 days by the river, Ayana had become important to him. On his last night in Silverton, Thomas sat in the town's only saloon, listening to the miners talk about their work and their families. The conversation was familiar and comfortable, but Thomas felt like he was listening from far away. "You seem quiet tonight, Thomas," said Jake Morrison, an old miner who had known Thomas for several years. "Something bothering you?" Thomas considered telling Jake about Ayana, but decided against it. Jake was a good man, but like most miners, he had little love for the Apache people. There had been conflicts between the miners and the local tribes, mostly over water rights and mining claims that crossed into Apache territory. "Just tired from the trail," Thomas said. "Long trip this time." Jake nodded and bought Thomas another beer. "You be careful out there," he said. "Heard there's been Apache activity in the area. Nothing violent, mind you, but they've been seen more than usual. Probably just hunting, but you never know." Thomas's heart jumped. Apache activity near Silverton could mean that Ayana's people were in the area. Maybe she had made it home safely, after all. Or maybe her people were out looking for her. Any trouble? Thomas asked, trying to sound casual. Nah, Jake said. Just sightings. But the cavalry boys are keeping an extra eye out, just in case. Thomas finished his beer and went to bed, but sleep did not come easily. He lay on his narrow cot in the boarding house, thinking about Ayanna walking alone through the desert. The turquoise necklace lay warm against his chest, and sometimes Thomas thought he could feel it getting warmer, as if it were trying to tell him something. The next morning, Thomas prepared to leave Silverton. His next destination was a small farming settlement called Cedar Springs, about 4 days' ride to the south. The farmers there needed different supplies than the miners: seeds, farming tools, and cloth for making clothes. Thomas bought new merchandise from Bill Henderson's store and loaded his pack mules. The animals were rested and ready for the trail. Belle seemed eager to go, pawing the ground and snorting in the cool mountain air. As Thomas rode out of Silverton, several of the miners called out farewells and wishes for a safe journey. Thomas waved back, but his mind was already on the trail ahead. The route to Cedar Springs would take him back through Apache territory, closer to where Ayanna's people lived. Thomas told himself he was not hoping to see Ayanna again. Their paths had crossed once by chance, and that was probably all it would ever be. She had her life with her people, and he had his work as a trader. They came from different worlds, and those worlds rarely mixed peacefully. But as Thomas guided Belle down the mountain trail, away from Silverton and back toward the desert, he found himself looking at every distant figure, hoping to see a tall Apache woman with long black hair. The necklace seemed to grow warmer against his chest, and Thomas began to think that maybe, just maybe, his story with Ayanna was not finished yet. The trail wound down from the mountains into rolling hills covered with brush and small trees. This was the edge of Apache country, where the mountains met the desert. Thomas had traveled this way many times, but never with such awareness of who might be watching from the hills. He did not see any Apache people that first day, but Thomas felt like he was being observed. It was not a threatening feeling, more like curiosity. Several times Belle's ears perked up and she looked toward the hills, as if she had heard or smelled something that Thomas could not detect. That night, Thomas made camp in a grove of oak trees near a small spring. The water was clear and cold, perfect for cooking and washing. As Thomas prepared his simple meal, he thought about Ayanna and wondered if she knew this place. Had she gathered medicinal plants here? Had she drunk from this same spring? After eating, Thomas sat by his fire and took out the turquoise necklace. In the firelight, the carved eagle seemed almost alive. The blue-green stone caught the light and held it, glowing like a small piece of the sky. Thomas thought about Ayanna's words when she had given him the necklace. She had said it would protect him and help him see danger before it found him. The time, Thomas had thought she was just being polite, the way people were when they gave gifts. Now he began to wonder if there might be more to it than that. The Apache people had lived in this land for hundreds of years. They had learned to survive in places where other people would die. Maybe their knowledge went beyond just plants and water sources. Maybe they understood things about the desert that white people had never learned. Thomas woke up before dawn, the way he always did on the trail. The sky was still dark, with only a thin line of gray light on the eastern horizon. His small fire had burned down to cold ashes during the night, but the air was warm enough that he had not needed the heat. Something was different this morning. Thomas could feel it even before he opened his eyes completely. Belle and the mules were restless, shifting their weight and making soft, snorting sounds. In his years of trading, Thomas had learned to trust his animals. They could sense things that humans missed. Thomas sat up quietly and looked around the camp. Everything appeared normal. The oak trees, the small spring, his packs arranged neatly where he had left them. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than it had been the day before. Thomas dressed quickly and began to pack his gear. He moved quietly, not wanting to make any noise that might carry in the still morning air. As he rolled up his blankets, he touched the turquoise necklace under his shirt. The carved eagle felt warm, warmer than it should have been from just his body heat. By the time the sun rose above the hills, Thomas was ready to travel. He led Belle and the mules away from the spring, following the trail toward Cedar Springs. The morning was beautiful, with clear blue sky and a gentle breeze that carried the sweet smell of desert flowers. But Thomas could not shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The necklace seemed to be growing warmer with each mile he traveled. Several times he found himself looking over his shoulder, expecting to see someone following him. Around mid-morning, Thomas stopped to rest the animals near a small creek. The water was shallow but clean, good for drinking and washing. Thomas filled his canteens and let Belle and the mules drink their fill. As Thomas prepared to continue his journey, he heard something that made his blood freeze. It was the sound of many horses moving fast across hard ground. The sound was coming from the north, from the direction he had traveled the day before. Thomas quickly led his animals behind a large boulder and waited. The sound grew louder, and Thomas could tell that there were at least 6 or 7 horses, maybe more. In Apache country, a group of riders moving that fast usually meant one of two things. They were chasing someone, or they were running from someone. The riders came into view around a bend in the creek. Thomas felt his heart jump when he saw them. They were Apache warriors, riding painted horses and carrying weapons. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that these were not young men out hunting. These were serious warriors on serious business. Leader of the group rode a magnificent black horse with white markings on its face and legs. The man himself was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing traditional Apache clothing, decorated with silver ornaments. His long gray hair was pulled back and held by a beaded band, and he wore a war bonnet made of eagle feathers that marked him as a chief or important leader. Thomas pressed himself against the boulder and hoped they would ride past without seeing him. His rifle was loaded, but one man with one gun would not last long against 7 Apache warriors. His best hope was to stay hidden until they were gone. But Belle had other ideas. The mare had seen the horses and wanted to greet them, the way horses naturally do. Before Thomas could stop her, she whinnied loudly. The sound carried clearly across the quiet morning air. The Apache warriors stopped immediately. Their leader held up his hand, and all 7 men sat perfectly still on their horses, listening and looking for the source of the sound. Thomas knew he had been discovered. For a moment, nobody moved. Thomas stayed behind his boulder, and the Apache warriors stayed on their horses 50 yards away. The silence stretched out like a tight rope that might snap at any second. Then the leader spoke, and his voice carried clearly across the distance between them. To Thomas's amazement, the man spoke in English. "White man behind the rock," the chief said. "We know you are there. Come out so we can see you." Thomas's mouth went dry. He had 2 choices: come out and face whatever the Apache warriors wanted, or try to run and probably get shot in the back. Either choice seemed very good. But as Thomas hesitated, he remembered Ayana's words about her father. She had said that Chief Nalnish was a wise leader and a good man. Could this be him? And if it was, would he remember that Thomas had helped his daughter? Thomas took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the boulder. He kept his hands where the warriors could see them, making no move toward his rifle. Belle and the mules followed him, and Thomas was grateful that the animals seemed calm. The Apache warriors studied Thomas carefully. Their leader rode closer, and Thomas could see his face clearly now. The man was older than Thomas had first thought, probably in his 50s, with deep lines around his eyes and gray streaks in his black hair. But his body was still strong, and he sat on his horse like a man who had been riding since childhood. Most importantly, Thomas could see intelligence in the man's dark eyes. This was not a hot-headed young warrior looking for a fight. This was a leader who thought before he acted. "You are Thomas Mitchell," the chief said. It was not a question. Thomas felt his heart jump again. How did this Apache chief know his name? Thomas was sure he had never met this man before, yet the chief spoke as if he knew exactly who Thomas was. "Yes," Thomas said, his voice coming out rougher than he had intended. "I am Thomas Mitchell." The chief nodded slowly. "I am Nalnish, chief of the Chiricahua Apache. I have been looking for you." Thomas felt the turquoise necklace grow hot against His chest. This was Ayana's father, the man she had spoken of with such pride and love. But why was he looking for Thomas? Had something bad happened to Ayana after she left him by the river? Is Ayana? Thomas started to ask, but Chief Nalnish held up his hand. My daughter is safe, the chief said. She is at home with our people, and she is well. But she told me a story that I had to hear for myself, from the man who lived it. Chief. Nalnish dismounted from his black horse and walked toward Thomas. The other warriors stayed on their horses, but Thomas could see that they had relaxed a little. Their weapons were still ready, but they were no longer pointing them in his direction. 3 days ago, Chief Nalnish said, stopping about 10 feet from Thomas, my daughter came home wet and hurt, with cuts on her arms and a story of being saved from the river by a white trader. At first I thought she might be confused from hitting her head in the water, but she described you perfectly and she told me your name. Thomas nodded. I pulled her from the Colorado River. She would have drowned if I had not helped her. Yes, Chief Nalnish said. But that is not the most important part of her story. She also told me that you cared for her when she was unconscious. You kept her warm and treated her wounds. You gave her food and protected her through the night. You did these things for a stranger, an Apache woman you had never seen before. Thomas felt uncomfortable with the praise. Any decent person would have done the same thing, he said. Chief Nalnish shook his head. You are wrong, Thomas Mitchell. Most white men would not have risked their lives to save an Apache woman. Some would have let her drown. Others might have saved her but then tried to trade her back to us for money or goods. You did neither of these things. Thomas did not know what to say. He had never thought of his actions as being particularly noble. When he saw someone drowning, he helped them. It seemed like the natural thing to do. Ayana also told me, Chief, Nalnish continued, that you would not take payment for what you did. She had to force you to accept her necklace, and even then you did not want to take it. Without thinking, Thomas touched the spot on his chest where the necklace lay hidden under his shirt. Chief Nalnish saw the gesture and nodded. You are wearing it, the chief said. Good. That necklace has protected the women of my family for 5 generations. Now it will protect you. Chief Nalnish, Thomas said, I am honored that Ayana gave me this gift. But I want you to know that I did not help her expecting any reward. I would do the same thing again, for anyone. I know that, Chief Nalnish said. That is why I rode out to find you. In Apache tradition, when someone saves the life of a family member, a debt is created. This debt must be paid or it brings bad fortune to both families. Thomas began to understand. This was not just about thanking him for helping Ayana. This was about Apache law and custom, things that were as important to Chief Nalnish as written laws were to white people. The necklace was Ayana's payment to you, Chief Nalnish said, but I am her father and the leader of our people. My debt to you is much larger than hers. One of the other warriors rode closer and spoke to Chief Nalnish in Apache. Thomas could not understand the words, but he could tell that the warrior was asking a question. Chief Nalnish answered briefly, then turned back to Thomas. My men are wondering why we are talking so long to a white man, Chief Nalnish said with a slight smile. They think I should just give you a horse and some supplies and send you on your way. What do you think? Thomas asked. Chief Nalnish studied Thomas for a long moment as if he were trying to see into his heart and judge what kind of man he really was. I think, the chief said slowly, that you are not like other white traders who come into our land. I think you have honor, and I think you might be someone who could be trusted. Thomas felt the weight of those words. Thomas stood alone in the desert for a long time after Chief Nalnish and his warriors rode away. The map felt heavy in his hands, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. This piece of deerskin could change everything about his life. He carefully unrolled the map and studied it more closely. The detail was incredible. Every mountain, every river, every important landmark was marked with symbols that Thomas was beginning to understand. Here was a symbol that must mean water. There was another that probably indicated a safe place to camp. The whole territory was laid out like a book, waiting to be read by someone who knew how to interpret its secrets. Thomas had been trading in this region for 12 years, but he realized now that he had only seen a tiny part of it. The trails, he knew, were marked on this map, but there were dozens of other trails he had never heard of. There were water sources in places he had thought were empty desert. There were mountain passes he had never imagined existed. With this map, Thomas could reach settlements and trading posts that took other traders weeks to find. He could avoid dangerous areas and find the best routes through difficult country. Most importantly, he could trade with Apache bands that no other white man had ever been allowed to approach. But the map was only part of what Chief Nalnish had offered. The real prize was the protection and trust of the Apache people. Thomas had heard stories of traders who tried to work in Apache territory without permission. Some were robbed, others were killed. A few simply disappeared and were never seen again. With Apache protection, Thomas would be as safe in their territory as he was in any white settlement. He could travel alone without fear, knowing that Apache warriors were watching over him. If he got into trouble with bandits or wild animals, help would come. The economic possibilities were staggering. Thomas had always made a decent living as a trader, but he had never dreamed of becoming wealthy. With exclusive access to Apache territory and Apache goods, he could build a trading empire that would make him one of the richest men in the Southwest. But Thomas knew that wealth was not the most important thing Chief Nalnish was offering him. The chief was offering him a chance to build a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for decades. Thomas could be the man who helped Apache and white people understand each other better. As Thomas rolled up the map and put it safely in his pack, he thought about the responsibility that would come with Chief Nalnish's offer. If he accepted, he would not just be a trader anymore. He would be an ambassador, representing both sides to each other. Every action he took would reflect on the Apache people's judgment in trusting him. Thomas made camp that night in a sheltered spot between two large rocks. He built a small fire and cooked his simple meal, but his mind was far from food. He kept thinking about Ayanna and the moment when she had given him her necklace. She had said that Apache people honor their debts, and now Thomas was learning just how seriously they took that responsibility. He also thought about what Ayanna had told him about her father. She had said Chief Nalnish was wise and fair, a leader who always tried to do what was best for his people. The offer Chief Nalnish had made was generous beyond anything Thomas could have expected. But Thomas understood that it was also a calculated risk. By choosing to trust Thomas, Chief Nalnish was betting that one white trader could help change the relationship between Apache and white people. If Thomas proved worthy of that trust, both sides might benefit. But if Thomas betrayed that trust, either through greed or carelessness, the consequences could be terrible for everyone. Thomas pulled out the turquoise necklace and held it in the firelight. The little carved eagle seemed to be looking at him, as if it were waiting to see what decision he would make. Ayanna had said the necklace would protect him and help him see danger before it found him. Now Thomas wondered if it might also help him see the right path when he came to an important crossroads. As the fire burned lower, Thomas made his decision. He had pulled Ayanna from the river because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected any reward. Now he was being offered a chance to do something even more important, to help two different peoples learn to live together in peace. The risks were real. Some white people would not understand why Thomas was working with the Apache. They might see him as a traitor or a fool. Some Apache people might also question their chief's decision to trust a white man. Thomas would be walking a narrow path between two worlds, and one mistake could destroy everything. But Thomas also knew that someone had to take that first step. Someone had to be willing to risk everything for the chance to build something better. Chief Nalnish had taken the first step by making his offer. Now it was Thomas's turn to show the same courage. Thomas slept well that night, better than he had slept since leaving Silverton. In his dreams, he saw himself traveling the trails marked on Chief Nalnish's map, carrying goods between Apache and white settlements, helping both sides prosper through honest trade. He woke up before dawn as always, but this time he felt different. This was the morning when his old life would end and his new life would begin. Thomas packed his gear with extra care, knowing that today would be a day he would remember for the rest of his life. Chief Nalnish arrived just as the sun was rising above the eastern hills. This time, he brought only 2 warriors with him instead of the whole group. Thomas understood that this was a sign of trust. The chief was showing that he did not consider Thomas to be dangerous. "Have you made your decision, Thomas Mitchell?" Chief Nalnish asked as he dismounted from his black horse. "I have," Thomas said. "I accept your offer, and I promise to honor the trust you are placing in me." Chief Nalnish nodded slowly, and Thomas thought he saw approval in the chief's dark eyes. "Good. But before we perform the ceremony, there are things you must understand about what you are agreeing to." The chief gestured for Thomas to sit on a flat rock, and he sat down across from him. The 2 warriors remained mounted, but they relaxed their alert posture. "When you become an honorary member of our tribe," Chief Nalnish said, "you will have rights and responsibilities. You will have the right to travel safely in our territory and to trade with our people. But you will also have the responsibility to treat our people fairly and to respect our customs." Thomas nodded. "I understand." "You will also have the responsibility to be honest with us," Chief Nalnish continued. "If you learn of any plans by white people to harm our people, you must warn us. If you discover any of our people planning to harm white people, you must try to stop them." This was a heavy responsibility, and Thomas felt the weight of it. By accepting Chief Nalnish's offer, he would be agreeing to put peace and justice above loyalty to any one group. He would have to be fair to everyone, even when fairness was difficult. "I agree to that as well," Thomas said. Chief Nalnish studied Thomas's face carefully. "There is one more thing. Ayanna told me that you have a good heart, but she also said that you do not yet understand the full power of what she gave you. The necklace you wear is not just a pretty ornament. It carries the spiritual protection of our ancestors." Thomas touched the necklace through his shirt. "I am honored to wear it, but I am not sure I understand what you mean about spiritual protection. Our people believe that the spirits of our ancestors watch over us," Chief Nalnish explained. "The eagle carved on that necklace is a messenger to those spirits. As long as you wear it with respect and use its power wisely, you will have guidance and protection that go beyond what any man can provide." Thomas had been raised in a Christian household, and he was not sure what to make of Apache spiritual beliefs. But he had felt the necklace growing warm at important moments, and he could not deny that something unusual was happening. "I will wear it with respect," Thomas promised. Chief Nalnish stood up and walked to his horse. He untied another leather bundle from his saddle and brought it back to where Thomas sat. This bundle was smaller than the one that had contained the map, but Thomas could tell that it was also important. "This," Chief Nalnish said as he unwrapped the bundle, "contains the symbols of your new status among our people." Inside the leather wrapping were several items. There was an eagle feather, pure white, except for a black tip. There was a small medicine bag made of soft leather and decorated with beads. There was also a piece of paper covered with writing in both English and Apache symbols. "The eagle feather marks you as a friend of our tribe," Chief Nalnish explained. "The medicine bag contains herbs that will bring you good fortune in trading and protection during your travels. The paper is a safe passage document that you can show to any Apache band. It tells them who you are and that you have my protection." Thomas looked at these gifts with wonder. Each one represented trust and acceptance from people who had little reason to trust any white man. The responsibility was overwhelming, but so was the honor. "There is one more gift," Chief Nalnish said, "but this one is not something I can give you. It is something you must earn." "What is that?" Thomas asked. Chief Nalnish smiled. "An Apache name. When you have proven yourself worthy through your actions, our people will give you a name in our language. Until then, you will be known as Thomas Mitchell, friend of the Chiricahua Apache." Thomas sat quietly for several minutes after Chief Nalnish and his warriors disappeared over a distant hill. The eagle feather in his hair moved gently in the morning breeze, and the medicine bag felt warm against his chest next to Ayanna's necklace. Everything had happened so fast that Thomas needed time to understand what his life had just become. He was no longer just Thomas Mitchell, traveling trader. He was now Thomas Mitchell, honorary member of the Chiricahua Apache tribe, and official trader to their people. The title felt strange and wonderful at the same time. Thomas carefully packed his new treasures with his other supplies. The map went into his most secure pack, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect it from rain and dust. The safe passage document went into his shirt pocket, where he could reach it quickly if needed. The eagle feather he left in his hair, knowing that it would be the first thing other Apache people would notice about him. As Thomas prepared to continue his journey toward Cedar Springs, he began to think about what Chief Nelnish's offer really meant. The economic possibilities were enormous, but Thomas was beginning to realize that the true value was not in money. For the first time in his life, Thomas had a chance to do something that mattered beyond his own survival. He could help bring peace between two peoples who had been fighting for decades. He could show white settlers that Apache people were not savage enemies, but intelligent human beings with rich traditions and valuable knowledge. He could show Apache people that not all white men were greedy invaders, but that some could be trusted partners. The responsibility was frightening, but it was also exciting. Thomas had always been a man who enjoyed challenges, and this was the biggest challenge of his life. As Belle carried him down the trail toward Cedar Springs, Thomas began to plan his new approach to trading. In the past, he had simply bought goods in one place and sold them in another, making a small profit on each transaction. Now he could do so much more. With his Apache map, Thomas could reach isolated settlements that no other trader had ever found. He could offer them goods they desperately needed, and he could pay fair prices because he would have no competition. The Apache people also had goods that white settlers wanted: beautiful blankets, well-made tools, and knowledge about survival in the desert. Thomas could become the link between these two worlds, helping both sides get what they needed. The Apache could trade their goods for metal tools, cloth, and other manufactured items. The white settlers could trade their factory goods for Apache crafts and knowledge, but Thomas knew that building this bridge would not be easy. Many people on both sides would be suspicious of what he was trying to do. Some white settlers hated all Apache people and would not want to trade with them. Some Apache people hated all white people and would not trust Thomas, even with Chief Nelnish's protection. Thomas would have to prove himself slowly, one transaction at a time, one relationship at a time. He would have to be more careful than he had ever been before, because one mistake could destroy everything. As Thomas thought about these challenges, the turquoise necklace grew warm against his chest. He pulled it out and looked at the tiny, carved eagle in the morning sunlight. Ayana had said the necklace would help him see danger before it found him. Now Thomas wondered if it might also help him see opportunities before others noticed them. Thomas reached Cedar Springs that afternoon. The farming settlement was smaller than Silverton, just a dozen families trying to grow crops in the difficult desert soil. The farmers were struggling, but they were determined to make their settlement succeed. The leader of Cedar Springs was a man named Samuel Webster, a former soldier who had decided to try farming after his military service ended. Samuel was a practical man who judged people by their actions rather than their words. "Thomas," Samuel called out when he saw the familiar figure riding into town. "Good to see you made it. We were starting to worry that something might have happened to you on the trail." Thomas dismounted from Belle and shook Samuel's hand. "Had some delays," Thomas said, "but nothing I couldn't handle." As Thomas unpacked his goods, several of the farmers gathered around to see what he had brought. Thomas had seeds for crops that would grow well in desert soil, tools for digging wells, and cloth for making clothes that would protect against the harsh sun. But Thomas also had something new: beautiful Apache blankets and baskets that he had acquired from friendly bands during previous trips. In the past, Thomas had been careful not to mention that these goods came from Apache people, knowing that many white settlers were prejudiced against them. Today, Thomas decided to take a small risk. When Mrs. Elizabeth Harper admired one of the blankets, Thomas told her the truth. "That blanket was made by Apache women," Thomas said. "They use traditional patterns that have been passed down for generations. The wool comes from sheep they raise themselves, and they dye it with plants they gather in the desert." Mrs. Harper looked surprised. "Apache women made this? But it's so beautiful and well made." Apache people are skilled craftsmen, Thomas said. They make some of the finest blankets and baskets in the territory. Samuel Webster frowned. Thomas, you know we've had trouble with Apache raids in this area. Are you sure it's wise to be trading with them? Thomas had expected this reaction. Samuel, he said, the Apache people I trade with are peaceful. They want the same things we do, safety for their families and a chance to prosper through honest work. Not all Apache bands are hostile. Some of them want to find ways to live in peace with their white neighbors. Samuel looked skeptical, but Mrs. Harper was still examining the blanket. It really is beautiful work, she said. How much do you want for it? Thomas named a fair price, and Mrs. Harper bought the blanket without hesitation. Several other settlers also purchased Apache goods, though some seemed nervous about it. That evening, Thomas sat with Samuel Webster by a small fire outside the settlement's general store. The two men had known each other for several years, and Samuel was one of the few people Thomas trusted completely. Thomas, Samuel said, I noticed something different about you today. You seem changed somehow. And what's that feather in your hair? Thomas had been wondering when someone would ask about the eagle feather. He decided to tell Samuel the truth, or at least part of it. I helped an Apache woman who was drowning in the Colorado River, Thomas said. Her father gave me this feather as a token of thanks. He also gave me permission to trade safely in Apache territory. Samuel's eyes widened. You saved an Apache woman's life, and her father was grateful instead of suspicious. Not all Apache people are our enemies, Samuel, Thomas said. Some of them are willing to be friends if we treat them fairly. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. You know, he said finally, we've been having trouble with water here in Cedar Springs. Our wells are running dry and we don't know where to dig new ones. Do you think your Apache friends might know where to find water in this area? Thomas felt his heart jump. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he had hoped for. They might, he said carefully. The Apache people have lived in this desert for hundreds of years. They know where the water sources are. Would they be willing to help us? Samuel asked. Thomas thought about Chief Nalnish and the responsibility he had accepted. This could be his first chance to prove that cooperation between Apache and white people was possible. I could ask them, Thomas said, but it would have to be done carefully. Some of your neighbors might not like the idea of asking Apache people for help. Samuel nodded. Let me talk to the other families. If we can find water, it might save our settlement. And if working with the Apache is what it takes, well, maybe it's time we tried a different approach. Over the next few days, Thomas conducted his usual business in Cedar Springs. But he also had many conversations with the settlers about the Apache people. Some of the farmers were interested in Thomas's stories about Apache knowledge of desert survival. Others remained suspicious and hostile. Thomas was patient with everyone, answering their questions and trying to help them see Apache people as human beings rather than faceless enemies. He told them about Ayana's knowledge of medicinal plants and about Chief Nalnish's wisdom and fairness. Slowly, Thomas began to see a change in some of the settlers' attitudes. They were still cautious, but they were willing to listen. Mrs. Harper told her friends how well made her Apache blanket was. Samuel Webster talked about the possibility of learning desert farming techniques from people who had been growing crops in this climate for generations. By the end of the week, Samuel had talked to all the families in Cedar Springs. Most of them were willing to try Thomas's idea of asking the Apache for help with finding water. A few were still opposed, but they were outnumbered by the families who were desperate enough to try anything. All right, Thomas, Samuel said. If you can arrange a meeting with your Apache friends, we're willing to talk to them. But it has to be peaceful and safe for everyone. Thomas felt a surge of excitement. This was his first real test as a bridge between the two worlds. If he could arrange a successful meeting between the Cedar Springs settlers and some of Chief Nalnish's people, it would prove that cooperation was possible. I'll need to travel into Apache territory to speak with their leaders, Thomas said. Thomas rode into Apache territory 3 days later, following the trails marked on Chief Nalnish's map. The deerskin chart was more accurate than any map he had ever used. Every landmark was exactly where it should be. Every water source was clean and reliable, and every trail led precisely where the symbols indicated it would go. As he traveled deeper into Apache lands, Thomas began to see signs that he was being watched. It was nothing obvious, just a movement on a distant ridge, a few horses' hoofprints that had not been there the day before, smoke from a fire that disappeared too quickly to be accidental. Thomas was not alarmed. These were Apache scouts, doing their job of protecting their territory. They had seen his eagle feather and safe passage document, and they were letting him travel freely while keeping an eye on him. On the fourth day, Thomas reached the place marked on his map as Chief Nalnish's main camp. It was hidden in a valley, between two mesas, invisible from any direction until a person was almost on top of it. Thomas was impressed by the strategic location. An army could search for weeks and never find this place. As Thomas rode down into the valley, he saw his first Apache village. It was bigger than he had expected, with more than 50 teepees arranged in careful patterns along a clear running stream. Children played between the teepees while women worked on various tasks, preparing food, making clothes, and crafting the beautiful baskets and blankets that Thomas had learned to admire. The men of the village were mostly away, probably hunting or scouting, but Thomas could see that this was a prosperous and well-organized community. These were not savage nomads, as some white people believed. These were civilized people with their own customs, laws, and ways of life. Chief Nalnish emerged from one of the larger teepees as Thomas approached. The chief looked pleased to see him, and Thomas felt relieved. His first official visit to an Apache village was off to a good start. "Thomas Mitchell," Chief Nalnish said, raising his hand in greeting. "Welcome to our home. I see you have learned to use our map well." "Your map is the finest I have ever seen," Thomas replied, dismounting from Bell. It made the journey easy and safe. Other Apache people began to gather around them, curious about the white trader who wore an eagle feather in his hair and had the chief's obvious approval. Thomas saw men and women of all ages, from elderly grandparents to young children who peeked out from behind their mother's skirts. And then Thomas saw Ayanna. She stepped out from behind one of the teepees, tall and graceful, her long black hair shining in the afternoon sunlight. She looked completely healthy now, with no sign of her terrible experience in the river. When she saw Thomas, her face lit up with a beautiful smile. "Thomas," she said, walking toward him with her distinctive, long strides. "My father told me you accepted his offer. I am very happy." Thomas felt his heart jump when he saw Ayanna again. During the weeks since their parting by the river, he had often wondered if he would ever see her again. Now here she was, more beautiful than he had remembered, welcoming him to her people's home. "Ayanna," Thomas said, suddenly feeling tongue-tied. "You look well. I was worried about your journey home." Ayanna laughed, the same musical sound Thomas remembered from their camp by the river. "I am Apache," she said. "The desert is my home, remember?" Chief Nalnish watched the exchange between Thomas and his daughter with sharp eyes. Thomas wondered what the chief was thinking. Did he approve of the obvious friendship between Thomas and Ayanna? Or was he concerned about a white man being too friendly with his daughter? "Come," Chief Nalnish said, gesturing toward his teepee. "We will eat and talk about what brings you here." Thomas followed the chief into the large teepee, with Ayanna walking beside them. The inside of the teepee was comfortable and well furnished, with soft rugs on the ground and beautiful decorations hanging from the poles. It was clear that Chief Nalnish was an important and wealthy leader. As they ate a meal of roasted meat and wild vegetables, Thomas explained about the settlers in Cedar Springs and their need for water. He was careful to present the request in a way that would appeal to Chief Nalnish's practical nature. "These farmers want to grow food in the desert," Thomas said. "They are struggling because they do not know where to find reliable water sources. They have heard that Apache people have knowledge of desert survival that could help them." Chief Nalnish listened carefully, asking occasional questions about the settlers and their intentions. Thomas could see that the chief was weighing the risks and benefits of cooperating with white people. What do these farmers offer in return for our help? Chief Nalnish asked. They have tools and manufactured goods that your people might find useful, Thomas said. They also have seeds for crops that might grow well in your territory and knowledge of farming techniques that could increase your food production. Ayanna spoke up. Father, I have seen this man's character. He saved my life and asked for nothing in return. If he says these farmers can be trusted, I believe him. Chief Nalnish looked at his daughter with obvious pride and affection. You think I should agree to this meeting? I think, Ayanna said carefully, that our people need new ways to prosper in a changing world. The old ways are still important, but we must also learn new ways. Working with friendly white people could help us prepare for the future. Thomas was impressed by Ayanna's wisdom. She understood that the world was changing and that Apache people would need to adapt to survive. She also understood that cooperation was better than constant conflict. Chief Nalnish was quiet for several minutes, thinking about what he had heard. Finally, he spoke. I will send 3 of my best men with you to meet these farmers, he said. They will look at the land around Cedar Springs and decide if our people can help with finding water. If the meeting goes well, we can discuss a larger partnership. Thomas felt a surge of excitement. Chief Nalnish was taking the first step toward the kind of cooperation Thomas had dreamed about. Who will you send? Thomas asked. My brother, Running Bear, who knows more about finding water than anyone in our tribe, Chief Nalnish said. Also Grey Wolf, who is skilled at reading the signs of the land, and my son, Standing Elk, who speaks English well and can help with talking to. The farmers. Thomas nodded. These sounded like good choices. Men with the skills needed to help the farmers and the authority to speak for their people. When can we leave? Thomas asked. Tomorrow morning, Chief Nalnish said. But first, we will have a ceremony to mark this new partnership between our peoples. That evening, the entire village gathered around a large fire in the center of the camp. Chief Nalnish spoke to his people in Apache, explaining what was happening and asking for their support. Thomas could not understand the words, but he could see that most of the people approved of their chief's decision. Then Chief Nalnish called Thomas forward and spoke to him in English so that everyone could understand. Thomas Mitchell, the chief said, you came to us as a stranger who saved the life of my daughter. Now you leave as a friend who may help both our peoples prosper together. We give you a name in our language that honors what you have done and what we hope you will do. Chief Nalnish placed his hands on Thomas's shoulders and looked into his eyes. From this day forward, the chief said, you will be known among the Apache people as River Friend, the man who pulled one of our daughters from the water and then helped pull our 2 peoples toward peace. The Apache people around the fire began to chant River Friend in their own language. Thomas felt deeply moved by this honor. To have an Apache name was something very few white men had ever achieved. As the ceremony continued, Ayanna came to stand beside Thomas. In the firelight, she looked even more beautiful than usual, and Thomas found it hard to concentrate on what Chief Nalnish was saying. River Friend, Ayanna said quietly, I want you to know that I am proud to have played a part in bringing you to our people. I think great things will come from this new friendship. Thomas looked into Ayanna's dark eyes and saw something there that made his heart beat faster. Was it possible that she felt the same attraction that he was feeling? In the weeks since their parting by the Colorado River, Thomas had thought about Ayanna often. Now, seeing her again in her own home, surrounded by her people, he realized that his feelings went deeper than simple friendship. But Thomas also knew that any relationship between him and Ayanna would be complicated. They came from different worlds, and many people on both sides would not approve. For now, Thomas decided he would focus on building the trading partnership that Chief Nalnish had offered. If something more developed between him and Ayanna, it would have to happen naturally and carefully. The next morning, Thomas left the Apache village with Running Bear, Grey Wolf, and Standing Elk. As he rode away, he turned back once to wave at the people who had welcomed him so warmly. Ayanna stood at the edge of the village watching him go, and Thomas felt a strong pull to return to her. But first, he had work to do. The meeting with the Cedar Springs farmers would determine whether this new partnership between Apache and white people could really work. Everything Thomas had dreamed about since accepting Chief Nalnish's offer depended on the next few days. As Thomas and his 3 Apache companions rode toward Cedar Springs, the turquoise necklace felt warm against his chest.